Dear colleagues, we are beginning yet another session, and then I'm sure we'll now have the pleasure to introduce our expert now. Lena, you now have the floor. Andrusha knows enough about me to say, I don't know if whether my introduction will be good enough, but it will sure be sincere. I have already spoken about it, and not yet before this class, because Lev Gudkov has not yet spoken before this class. But I put the thought that just came to my mind, and the picture of our life is so huge nowadays that you keep track of what specialists or experts are writing about, or people who are within the events. Anyways, and especially the people whom you trust. And you are not in a state, in a condition which you can give no name. You are actually prepared for this reason, because you are reading their papers. And actually, I'm opening the articles that Lev Gudkov writes, very much like it's worth reading what Yuri Alexandrovich Levada is writing, who has also spoken before this class, and he's our favorite expert. And I've been reading, it's the third time, I suppose, that I've read his article, something about morality in an immoral society. And I also recommend it to you. I should say that it was written with passion, but it is a sophisticated article. And I don't find it difficult as I read it nowadays, because I'm all immersed into it. And I think it's the author who finds the right quotations in Russian literature and in Russian philosophical thought of antiquities, which I'm retelling then with pleasure, because I'm reading a lot what Lev Gudkov writes. Let me give you two quotations, please. In his article, he begins it with a quotation from Shchedrin, whom he is very fond of, and he says, "Poor is the country which you have to love." Then a very detailed analysis, given all the references, very much based. And again, a quote from Seneca, who says, "Today, the harvest is poor, but tomorrow we should still sow a new harvest." So we'd like to introduce to you Lev Gudkov. And when you are completely confused about all the expertise, reread what he writes. This year, he was awarded a very prestigious prize of political enlightenment as an author. And tomorrow, I suppose, Zimin will speak before us tomorrow. But today we have a winner of this prize who is speaking before us. Thank you very much. As always, I very much like talking here and taking your questions and debate things with you. But today, very much like last time, I want to share with you, first of all, speak about our studies, about public opinion surveys, which we've been doing for some 25 years ago. We started before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the most recent data that we included here We obtained them just literally 2 days ago. So I can keep track how things are changing, but it's not all about this. It seems to me that today we are at a situation that is so critical that we are fully aware of this. These are the turning points that will impact and determine the evolution and the situation in this country, not for the near months, but for the decades to come. These turning points is something that we witnessed back in 1993, in 1999, and right now we are living again through another critical turning point, critical moment. And it seems to me that in our society, against this patriotic and chauvinistic euphoria, our society is fully aware of this critical situation. This is what I want to talk about. I want to look at it in detail. But first of all, the situation has changed rapidly because of the downed bowing. What we measure, the reaction, the response to this is pretty much weak. Well, people are not fully aware what it is. Whereas Western community and the people in the West have drastically changed their attitude towards Russia. That was the last, how shall I put it, the last drop, probably the last point against Russia's reputation, and Russia obviously is clearly perceived and will be perceived as a rogue country, as a pariah country, that a country where you could put a cross upon. If there's nothing to expect, you should fence it and let it be alone and let it rot till the end. If you look at the headlines in the press, in the Western media, it's all about direct accusations of Russia's leadership, first of all of President Putin in person. They've already disregarding fine points, legal fine points, who shot it down, how did they do it. This is not something that matters. All kinds of legal casuistics are now disregarded, and they are already presenting a direct moral and political accusations. And if you look at the headlines, well, I suppose it was the Newsweek that showed a portrait of Putin as a dead head, like this image of death, with the enemy of the West #1, pariah. Russia is a country that sponsors terrorism, and other headlines, the crash of the Malaysian Airlines is the end of the Russian tale, another military crime by Putin and others. If you look at the response by Western political community and even business, that is very reluctant in about the use of sanctions against Russia. First of all, they are French and German business who are opposed, are very reluctant. But what is interesting, the day before yesterday, this is what the former Minister of Finance of Western Germany, this is what he put it: the economic interests of Germany in the matter about the use of sanctions against Russia do not count as paramount. The main priority in this situation, it's not about the economic costs. It's rather supporting peace and stability. They are the matters of the use of significance and importance of international law, which Russia is violating. So much for this situation of this direct resentment towards Russia. this strongly contrasts with what is going on in this country. We can put it this way, that before January, in some sense, we lived in a very different country from what we are in today, because the situation differed dramatically. Do let us look at the assessment of mass moods and position and situation in this country. Well, this is the graph of evaluations. If you can see this graph, beginning somewhere 1994, 93, 94, and after a strong decline and when Russia plummeted through the transformation crisis, the plummeting living standards, disappointment about the reforms, about the choice of the Western pathway, we see authoritarian expectations on the rise, the expectations of a strong hand of a savior. And Putin does not really set the stone. He's just investing into these expectations. And the first, if you look at it, this first wave of when you see the soaring expectations for the authoritarian leader, though the economic situation in the country has not yet improved, social indicators have gone up, and with certain, well, oscillations when we lost the submarine Kursk and then terror attacks in Beslan and in Dubrovka in Moscow, and especially mass protests in 2005 because of monetization of social benefits, that is when some social payments were done in cash instead of in kind, we still saw rising support and rising approval, and the peak of popularity is seen in August and September 2008 during the war with Georgia. Well, you can't compare it with what is going on right now, but nevertheless that was a patriotic rise, chauvinistic, militaristic rising moods, and full approval of what the country's leadership do. After that, almost immediately we saw economic crisis hit in autumn of 2008, rapid decline and growing of approval and growing disapproval in the cities where we see just fledgling middle class when they were unhappy about the leadership. They were first of all unhappy about refusal to carry out institutional reforms. But in the remote areas, in conservative province that continued to live according to the Soviet style in rural areas, they were not happy because the state refused to fulfill social obligations. They saw weakening paternalistic role by the state. But against this mass protests and very strongly dispersed social tension, this resentment, this discontent was seen, and the government was losing support, and we saw growing discontent by Putin in person and the system as a whole. We see it getting stronger because of ongoing corruption scandals, which led to strong delegitimation of the regime when they refused to acknowledge the equity and the justice of the election, not election alone. Sometime from 2004, it is acknowledged that in most cases the election is not fair, is not honest, is rigged, but discontent about the political system that is perceived as an unfair system. Despite all the efforts, quite strong financial investment before the election, they certainly produce a certain effect. And the one before last, this rise that has to do with stronger, with stronger propaganda among the electorate and more payments. The support is still declining, and people are more and more unhappy with the current government. They are tired of Putin's regime, which reaches its lowest level of support sometime in December and January, in December 2013, January 2014. This is the time when we see that a very large number of Russian citizens, up to 60%, are saying that they would not want to vote at the next election. They would not vote for Putin. They're tired of expectations of him, and they would want to see somebody new with a different agenda, with a different program, with a radically different, not even from the United Russia. The United Russia has lost its aura as a party in government, a party that could do something to change, effect some change in the country. And Navalny's slogan, United Russia is a party of swindlers and thieves. It gets something like support of among 50 or 40% of those surveyed who support this slogan. In other words, this is just a strongest discreditation of government that we see. Again, this index could be analyzed in its components to make it clear to you. Even in this situation, the propaganda campaign about Sochi Olympic Games does not produce any effect, although it certainly stops in its way this declining social tension, this discontent, but it just somewhat slows it down, but it cannot change the situation. The situation has changed. Dramatically. Please look at this graph. It reflects this process of delegitimation and falling social support for the government, of the personified government, and the overall attitude towards the political system in Russia. The situation is changing as events in Ukraine evolve, and the onset of the fantastic in its totality and intensity propaganda anti-Ukrainian campaign. This campaign produces this. It's not that the government recovers the legitimacy. Not only that, they also would get this powerful resource that when they recover both the support and the approval rates for the government of the country, the leadership of the country. In fact, to make it clear, the level of approval today, approval of President Putin nowadays is about 85%. If you look at the measurements in July, this is almost the maximum. We saw it higher in August 2008 when we saw 87% approval rate. Nowadays, given the statistical error, this is the maximum possible mobilization of the country. The country has radically changed its condition, the state it is in. What the leadership did in reunification with the Crimea received absolute support from the population of this country and has completely distanced all the reasons to be discontent about the leadership style, about corruption, about refusing to protect social rights, discrimination by the government and others. The society, due to these propaganda for many months, has moved into a stage that is called excitement, probably. That would be the right word to use. As Yuri Alexandrovich Levada put it, in the condition of excitement, the picture of reality is becoming more simple, more primitive, and in this situation, very simple mechanisms of consolidation, friend or foe, work. You see very simplified and archaistic myths that come to the surface about the savior, about the leader of the nation, and something that seemed to have gone at all. We see that we recover this position when the country is seeing itself as surrounded by a hostile camp, as a besieged castle, and so on. The world is becoming very simplified, oversimplified, when we divide things into black and white. What has actually happened at this time? And why is it that we achieved this, that we went to this primitivization of public conscience? And what is interesting, given this level of support at 85% or even more, among some aspects, we see all social differences disappear, intergroup differences disappear. This actually shows that propaganda has worked. There is no difference among the opinion of the public, rural public, and the city, whether people are educated or not, people with low level of education, whether they're young or old, entrepreneurs or the servicemen. Certainly they do exist, but they're insignificant. It is this condition when we see all social differences being erased that just shows that we see this mass impact, mass influence. This is actually what propaganda, how it works, first of all by television. On television. What happened? Back in October 2013, October-November, the events in Maidan were perceived quite calmly. Even some people understood what was going on. People felt that the situation in Ukraine, the economic situation in Ukraine, is close to disaster, and that the regime of Yanukovych has brought the country to a certain limit. And the indignation has not met any objection in most cases. Much rather, some even in that situation, there's declining trust in government. It worked as a parallel between what was going on in Ukraine and in Russia. May I remind you that ongoing corruption scandals were evolving, and there was no sphere in economy where we would not see a scandal related to corruption, be it the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Healthcare, Ministry of Education, Space, Agriculture, Law Enforcement, and you name it. 80% of those surveyed were saying there are signs of complete decline of the state and degradation. The only response to this was in November, that Russia should not interfere into what went on in Ukraine. More than two-thirds thought we do not need to interfere, let alone put any pressure upon either side. We thought it was the domestic affair of the Ukrainians. And even when the question rose about the European choice and accession, the EU accession, about concluding an agreement between Ukraine and the EU and the integration with the EU, that was also over 50% of those surveyed by us showed understanding, and it did not provoke any resentment. It was clear that probably the situation was perceived along the same lines in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when all hopes to overcome the crisis was at adopting the Western model, carrying out democratic institutional reforms, and actually people were under the spell of strong illusion that this choice of European path would produce an immediate effect, and we would see the times of economic miracle when living standards would rise sharply and so on. So just minority in Russian population perceived this withdrawal by Ukraine from the Eurasian Union as betrayal of Slavic brotherhood. It was perceived as something that we should oppose in every possible and every available way. About 27-29% of those surveys said so, but most of those surveyed, about 60%, were quite neutral about this. The situation began to change after an attempt to calm down, to quell the unrest in Maidan by force, and the onset of the most powerful propaganda campaign. I would put it this way: I don't remember such an intensive, aggressive propaganda campaign, even in the times of the Soviet Union, because the technology of manipulation by masses and organization of social life and social conscience that was used in Soviet times was very different. The first thing that happened was that alternative sources of information were shut down, and editorial boards of independent internet publications were just changed, and when they would block all alternative information. Another point.
And the second important aspect had to do with an assumption that the Maidan events had been inspired by the West, that was the propaganda bait that was immediately swallowed by the society, since it coincided with a long-term mythology about the Western conspiracies. And since it was inspired and masterminded by the West, and the West was manipulated the Ukrainian Democrats, then the latter had their own will. So that was the first aspect of inadequate action that triggered the mechanism of hostile attitudes towards Ukraine. The other aspect had to do with the fact that it was the ultra-nationalists who were trying to seize power in Kiev, and following the Yanukovych escape, they seized the power, and they were neo-Nazis, followers of Bandera, although very few people know who was Stepan Bandera, and anti-Semites. So the authorities began speaking the language of World War II, the language of opposing Nazism, and that really changed the perception and assessments made by the public. It was dominated by the feelings of fighting Nazism, nationalism, since in the Russian minds we understand that fascists are not human. They are not just enemies, they are anti-human. And the third aspect of propaganda was the fact that the seizure of power by those new forces supported by Maidan nationalists in the first place threatened the security of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, which required extraordinary measures to protect them. And respectively, that justified the use of troops, of force, in order to normalize the situation in Ukraine. And the fourth aspect of propaganda that was appeared to be quite meaningful, and following the acquiring of the Crimea, and following that referendum in the Crimea, was the statement that Russia was not only defending the ethnic Russians, but returning to its imperial status, and brings back the territories that were separated from Russia by some historical arrow. And I should admit that the Russian public was convinced that ethnic Russians were oppressed in Ukraine, and that there was a powerful movement of Ukrainians who didn't agree with those so-called democratic transformations in Kiev, and that the majority of Ukrainians were opposing the power in Kiev, specifically in the east of Ukraine. And it was a spontaneous effort that brought them to arms. The Ukrainian polls, or the polls conducted by international services, shows us an entirely different picture. Speaking of the entire Ukraine, 83% of the public are against separatists and are against the secession of eastern Ukrainian regions. That's the average data about Ukraine, which differs region-wise. 93% in the west of Ukraine and Lvov and other regions feel like that, and 68% of the polled expressed those views in Lugansk and in other eastern regions. I think Lugansk region is the only region where more than 30% were in favor of joining Russia, but the majority of the Ukrainians are against those armed conflict and against the use of force, although the situation beginning from March has changed greatly. The referendum in the Crimea that was used to legitimize the annexation of the Crimea is quite doubtful, since according to our measures, not more than 32 or 35% of the Crimean population took part in the referendum. So the outcomes were quite conflicting. 44 were against joining Russia, and 43 in favor of accession with Russia. And the referendum was conducted under the great influence of the Russian armed forces, and that is quite obvious. But in any event, there is very few knowledge about that in Russia, and what is most important, Russians do not want to know about that. You know what happened, and I can produce that slide showing the response here in the country to the situation in the Crimea. So it is at least curious to see, and it requires some kind of investigation. I mean, why that sudden unrest on the part of the population and displeasure of the Russians turned into the strong support of the regime. So it requires really a special investigation and analysis. One can understand that those events are perceived in quite a symbolic context. When we ask a question if you are prepared to pay extra costs for the annexation of the Crimea or these Ukrainian regions, only 7% fully agree with that, and about 12 to 13% are ready to make their contributions. But the absolute majority think that they are not to be involved, they are not to be impacted by those developments. And the understanding of the so-called right policy on the part of the Russian leadership, who demonstrate to the rest of the world and, first of all, to themselves, the triumph of their power and the consolidation of Russian geopolitical interests, irrespective of the fact if it is legitimate or not. So this fact is extremely important. As you can see, the decision of the Russian Federation leadership to annex the Crimea was approved by the majority of the population. About 80% gave their approval to that. About 60% feel that that was the triumph of justice, and they felt joy about that. And only 7% expressed their indignation, shame, or fear. In other words, we saw a total consolidation of the Russian society, because 80% means the total approval and in a consolidation around those goals. Why was it so important to demonstrate that power and acquire the Crimea? And the return of Russia to its traditional role? I think the reason is that it indicates, it hits the most sensitive points of the dual Russian consciousness. The feeling of unprotection, the feeling of not poverty, but kind of being raped, and it's compensated by the thought that we live in a great country, which is respected by the rest of the world, and which arouses the sense of fear in the rest of the world. So that essential greatness was something that consolidated the national mentality and had to do with the aspects of national mentality, our identity. So the right course of the leadership in this sense seems to be more important, more significant than any material costs or some damage to their private lives. Besides, there is another important aspect, and that is the restoration of tribal mentality, meaning that Russia is prepared to defend and protect compatriots, and it results from unsatisfaction with the levels of life. If you have a look at what are the greatest expectations of people from the leadership, then you see it's the care about their material wellness. It's not about the rules of the game in the society, but it's about the material well-being and prosperity of the people. And for the sake of that, people are ready to give up their claims about their political rights and some other rights. That is about a symbolic role of a strong leader and strong state that pushes forward national interests. So that makes up the foundations of the collective mentality or national identity in the Russian society. So that restoration of authoritarian statements and attitudes are quite actual, and it's quite relevant, and in some sense today we deal with uncompleted process, and not only that, but with the revival of those structures of mentality or consciousness that supported the Soviet Union, supported the authority of power in the Soviet Union. It doesn't imply that people are more respectful for the power, for the authorities now. Approval of its decency, fairness, on the opposite. The authorities are not respected for, and it's not accidental that I'm referring to those corruption scandals. If you look at the attitudes to the authorities beyond that symbolic plan, and that's the plan of restoration of the Russian historical role as the super or great power, then the power is viewed as a negative force. First of all, power at any level is viewed as corrupted, selfish, unfair. You can see the details here, and that's the very stable definition of the power of late. So what is typical about the current power and current politicians is the strong negative image of them. And what is typical of them? First of all, it's the strive for power, staying in power through all the means, corruption, neglect of people, non-professionalism, absence of morale, and even mental backwardness. And the positive definition of power are here at the bottom of the slide. But that's another story. And the question was, how would you describe the power of the ruling circles or the political class of Russia? And the answer is that their interests, first of all, is to maintain the power, to stay in power, to achieve material benefits, and as it is written sometimes by Western political analysts, they refer to the Putin's regime as plutocracy, and that's a regime when all risks are leveraged by the budget, while all benefits, all advantages are privatized and used for selfish interests. So the power is defined as being corrupt, selfish, mafiosi-like, and so on and so forth. And it applies to Putin. For some time, public opinion defended his image, but in the backdrop of protests and rallies when he returned to his third term in power, and he lost the status of being untouchable, being well-protected person. And similar claims are applied now to him as those that typical about the entire political system, the power system. If you look at the table, you can see how interesting facts are. Only a minor fraction of the poll say that the question was, do you think that Putin is to blame for corruption of the power? That question was asked following the appearance of the report on the link between Putin and corruption. Those reports' circulation was quite limited, but still about 3 million people read those reports in printed versions, and I think that several more millions read that report on the web, on the internet. So from 10 to 16% of the people give the affirmative answer that Putin was guilty about the corruption facts. And that's the small group with very firm attitudes. And the biggest group say perhaps, or maybe those accusations are true, because as any other high-ranking officials, Putin is involved, but I know very little about that. So the posture that Putin is part of the corruption is well spread, is well popular. And about a quarter, with some variations, of the people say that even if it is true, what is most important is that life has become better under Putin. And I think that's the most interesting question, because it indicates how immoral the power is. And since there is no potential for the power's assessments, there is a lack of filters, a lack of the ability or opportunity to control the power. So the power, if you elaborate further, enjoys its own sovereignty and arbiter rule, if you wish. With an ability to amend and change rules at their own discretion, meaning that they can violate law or adopt new laws, and that's a sign of the sovereignty of the power. And there is only a small fraction of power of the people. Only after the Crimea events it has doubled. Strongly rejects any rumors about the corruption and Putin. They say that they do not believe that Putin has ever misused now. From 11% in 2011, the number rose to 19% now. So the assumption that the power is guided by their own mean interests and is supported by law enforcement agencies and express their interests rather than the interests of the entire society. So the perception that power is out of control, so those perceptions are dominant now throughout the Russians. 85% of the people of the poll believe that they have no influence. They have no influence on decisions-making process, and they are not prepared to take part in politics because nothing depends on them. In other words, there is no contract with power, and there is no ability to control the power. So the power is a totally independent force which is fully sovereign in their activities. And the reason people do not want to take part, to get involved in politics, it's well understood in this country. It's because of apathy, since the majority of people do not believe that something can be changed. And politics is not for ordinary people. Politics is for the authorities, and I don't have time for politics. Politics is a dirty thing, and the like. In other words, with full discontent and dissatisfaction with the power, there is passivity, not involvement, and infantile attitudes, or serfdom mentality, if you wish. And that's the reason why the symbolic role of the power is assessed too high, and that high when power appeals to the traditional imperial values, when it demonstrates the dependency of ordinary people from power. Since the propaganda campaign began, the readiness of the people to take part in protests has reduced, and it happened even earlier, throughout 2013, following the peak of protests and rallies. When they failed, protest feelings were declining, and they are not seen, almost not seen now. And the reason why propaganda campaign was so important is the created feeling that the outside world is hostile to Russia. In 2009, only 13% of the Russians believed there were enemies to Russia in the world, and more than half, 52%, said that we didn't have to look for enemies because all problems were created by the Russians themselves. And following the third term of Putin, and even now, 87% Russians believe that Russia is really faced with enemies, adversaries, and most dangerous enemies are hidden enemies. That people who are reaffirming themselves, reasserting themselves, are always surrounded by enemies. That's really very important. It correlates with the idea of the symbolic status of the power on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's the explanation of their own inconsistency, independency, and when they explain everything by the standoff, a rivalry between Russia and the rest of the world. When that propaganda campaign began, and it was the focus of the campaign, the anti-Western, anti-US sentiments and attitudes were reinforced. 75%, two-thirds of the population now, voice their negative attitudes to the United States, and similarly to the European Union. Domestic consolidation is strengthened in the backdrop of the external enemy. How much time do I have more? Overall, we have half an hour to go. So, okay, let me wrap up my presentation and switch to Q&A. But again, in conclusion, I would like to cast another look at the ideology and the decline of the trust to the power and legitimation of the regime was accompanied by the internal xenophobia and nationalism that reached its peak last fall. And they were the highest throughout the period of our polls. So it was on the one hand, and on the other hand, the project of Ukraine's integration into Europe, reforms and the choice of European way was undermining Putin's project of the creation of Eurasian Union and really posed a lethal threat to the regime. Because in Ukraine, people might see a model of upheaval against the corrupted regime. So the Kremlin propaganda machine made their utmost to dismiss and discredit that regime as something that lost its Christian values and discredit the process of democratic reforms itself. Drawing a parallel between what was happening in Ukraine to some events that could be possible in Russia. And apart from what I have already said, I can also refer to the fear of the Russians in the face of social shocks. The horror and deep frustration that Russians inherited in 1990s arouse some conservative feelings and fear as there might be opportunities for some reforms and the recognition of the conservative course as opposes the reforms pursued by the middle class were strongly promoted by the Kremlin.
In the same way, there's a high degree of mythology introduced to this discourse, and the effect of these policies is exactly explained by the simplification of reality and somewhat basic black and white scenarios prevail of analysis. This pursues the purposes of solidification of the national support for the government. We cannot say if this wave will continue. I think that the public will start feeling fatigue of such policies, and the economic situation will continue to deteriorate, as well as the effect of the sanctions will be felt. We are indeed seeing a decrease in the quality of life by 1 to 1.5%, and it would probably be felt stronger. But the consequences of the restoration of the authoritarian regime will be felt primarily because we will see the further repressions against the civil society, the liberal movement, and the solidification of the authorities. And I think that these consequences will be felt for another generation. Colleagues, we're now starting with the session of questions and answers, and Elena will start this session. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question. These are indeed said numbers and indicators. The Soviet Union is made up of different fragments, including that picture of the Soviet Union, which the public sometimes sees, which is the victory, like the victory in World War II, but also the terror, collectivization, and other fragments which really make up this mosaic in the public consciousness. Have you made any polls with respect to the public's views of the different parts of this mosaic, of these parts of the Soviet history? I would understand the perception of the victory in the war. Well, yes, indeed, the general reaction to the history of the war victory as the pillar of the national consciousness is something that is viewed as the axis in the entire history, indeed justifying the repressions, the terror, and in the same way legitimizing the communist system. We have throughout the 25 years of our existence, we have measured this composition of the historical memory, and one may say that after a very intensive discussion in perestroika times related to the Stalin's period, this was very swiftly substituted by other things in the consciousness of the masses. Not that people have forgotten that the repressions did take place, but a conflict emerged in the national psyche, a controversy between the figure of Stalin as the victor in the Great War, in the World War II, and on the other hand, the figure of Stalin as indeed the chief criminal personally responsible for the mass killings and indeed murders. So indeed this moral stupor was caused by such a controversy, and many people, starting from about 1997, especially after President Mr. Putin's advance to power and the restoration and even re-Stalinization, even rehabilitation of Stalin's policies, people say that they cannot make the truth out of all this material, and it is best to forget and turn these pages of history, which is a most important factor. What we see, I would use a phrase of such German psychologists as Alexander and Margaret Mitterlich, who said in their work about the denazification, it is derealization of the past, the inability to digest the past, the inability to understand the nature of the Soviet system, of a repressive system, the inability to understand the nature of violence and the cost of this and the price of this violence and the after effects of this violence, and indeed marginalization of this whole topic in the public consciousness. Today, one may say that in the past, it is not just about Stalin's period, but generally about the Soviet past, it is fading away in the public mind. It is not... and it is substituted by some historical imitations, such as the traditional values, the different myths, and I may say that there may be a general the general there is a general and tacit understanding of horror, but it is not. It is a subjectless perception of history, because no perpetrators' names are given, no mechanisms are analyzed, no links and mechanisms and iterations and the composition of terror is considered, and thus the public mind does not engage itself with considering the question of responsibility, or else trying to analyze this mechanism consciousness in itself, which leads to a situation whereby these mechanisms of violence are perceived as codes of social conduct, because those who have the tools for coercion are socially more valuable, are higher up in the hierarchy, have a greater sovereignty, have greater value, have greater assets, have greater significance than any other citizen. If you look at the problem of violence, then it is indeed the denial of the rights of the other, of the rights of those who are affected by violence. And this indeed shows us that a man is devoid of significance. The human life is desacralized. A question from the Yamal-Nenets region of Russia. Well, you have the money. I should give you the floor. Sergei Yuriev from Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Region. I have a question to Mr. Gudkov. You have said that Mr. Putin's growth, rating growth, is mainly explained by the annexation of Crimea and the propaganda. But how can you then explain that the rating of Mr. Lukashenko grew against the background of the events in the Ukraine? This is something that I have seen in several sources, in several texts, and I could see that Mr. Lukashenko's rating went up. Well, frankly, I have not seen the recent data. Last year, something that we published several times, the data of the Belarusian social scientists and sociologists, the rating was going down. It was probably at 28% in 2013, and several years during the several agreements signed with Russia, Mr. Lukashenko's rating went up a little bit. I did not see, however, that it went up with any significance. And indeed, with the total control over the information field which we are seeing in Belarus and the repressions against the opposition, I can say that these are understandable things, such manipulations. But economically speaking, the crisis of 2010, 2011, and 2012 led to a sharp decrease in the popularity of Mr. Lukashenko. Oh, I just do not have the latest data. Well, let us think that. No, this is something that I read in the Western mass media. Well, there will be an article published by our Belarusian colleague in the next issue, and I think that he will publish new data on Mr. Lukashenko's position. I'm somewhat concerned that we are nearing the end of this day. Where are the voices of our foreign participants, my dear friends from abroad. Apart from Georgia, which indeed has nothing to lose, but I think that we have eight Poles, eight colleagues from Poland. In any event, do participate. We encourage your questions. No. No, I think that you take the floor at every session. No, please do not shout. Yeah. Vadim, yes. Do I understand it right that the session, I did not hear the name of the presentation, the authorities and the NGOs. Then I have a question. About the rehabilitation of the Soviet mentality. I do not know if you agree, but it appears that the dichotomy is such that you have to make to concede and agree with the official politics of the government tacitly, and then in the kitchen you can talk whatever you want. So is this what you mean by the rehabilitation of the Soviet stereotypes? Well, if you remember the works of Yuri Alexandrovich Levada, he called it the slyness of a Soviet man, being sly, and who at the same time showed the loyalty to the government, and on the other hand very hierarchical, very imperial, with attributing great value to the symbols and myths of a great power, starting from the expanse of the Soviet territory down to the heroic past, the military exploits and victories, the symbols and rituals. So, what the Soviet man was primarily proud of: the victory in the war and victories in other wars. The colonial and the expanse, and then the space programs, the nuclear weapons, science, and the great Russian literature to a modicum of a degree. So, when we speak about the restoration of the myths, it is not just about symbols, but also the structures in our mind. We live in a hostile surrounding. We are kind by nature. We're selfless. We are peace-loving. We're patient. We're open-minded. We're open to the world. The West is cold, calculating, mercantile, hostile. It is not accidental that throughout the 1990s, up to 68 to 70% of the respondents believed that the reforms of Yegor Gaidar were inspired by the West, and that the West thus wished to dismember Russia and to kneel it down, to colonize it, to get its greedy hand on its mineral resources, and ascribing to the West of such motives, shared by these people, and including the xenophobic complexes and the inferiority complex. They're related to the myth of the national leader, the Salvador the saver of the nation who must lead the nation out of crisis, and indeed expresses the somewhat infant-like perception by the people of itself. If you look at the structure of the attitude toward Mr. Putin, it is quite noteworthy. You might say that even though there might be some dynamics evident here, but positive the maximum you can see here is 2007, 2008. But generally speaking, we're talking about 20 to 30%. Only a small part regard the leader of the nation as an authoritarian figure, and the general mass is quite indifferent or full of apathy, passivity, with the total dependence on the government. The enigma of the Russian soul has indeed concerned only the Ukraine. Alexandra Azarkhina, talking of the propaganda machine, if we think that towards the end of the year, if there can, when you talked about the fatigue, do you believe that the political course will be corrected? Do you believe that the propaganda machine may be stopped? Do you believe that this will be done gradually, or else a repudiation of the previous steps and the previous policies? Well, I do not think that the political course will be changed. A year ago, when the public hearings called public alternative were held, I was saying that we should expect the toughening of the legislature and the repressions, because the legislative base was to be created, including the fines, the law of Dima Yakovlev, the law on defamation, the law on the information and data, on the fines. All these laws were indeed directed not only against the discrediting of the opposition, but also against the creation or the elaboration of a specific legislative base. And if in the beginning the majority indeed supported the opposition, and the first laws were regarded in quite a sober way as a way to silence the opposition, then having united the anti-Americanism, pedophilia, homosexuality, have led to changing the public attitudes, because this is how a propaganda machine works, by combining the very heterogeneous elements and indeed undermining the very ground for analysis. I do not think that the political course will change. What I might think might happen is that with about 65 to 70% of probabilities that Mr. Putin, under the direct pressure from the West and the pressure from the Western politicians, may act as a peacemaker, as a person who would be talking about the proposal, would be proposing to stop the bloodshed and to cease the fire, by at the same time supporting the destabilizing forces in the Ukraine, because the Kremlin is much more interested in a weak Ukraine and the chronic instability in that country. I think that the mask will be that of a peacemaker. But I do not think that this would in any way entail a radical shift of the policies. I do not expect Stalin-style repressions to restart. I think that these repressions will be rather pointed against some specific organizations of the civil society, the general curtailing of the public space, and the great discrediting of any forms and curtailing of any forms of democratic procedures, human rights, liberal movements, reforms, which are generally viewed as necessary by the middle class. So you think that the only way to stop the propaganda is to subvert the regime? What regime? When I was considering the anti-Semitism in the 1970s, when we believed that there is a wave of anti-Semitism, one rabbi told me, he said to me, "I'm not interested in the number of anti-Semites. I'm interested in the anti-anti-Semites. What is the potential of the anti-anti-Semites? What is the potential of the society for self-organization and the moral assessment?" And today, what we see is that the opposition is divided and demoralized. And I showed that only 7% of the population is in any way critical with respect to the policies in the Ukraine, the Russian policies in the Ukraine. Maybe a bit more, because this last measurement shows the growth of some fears related to the Ukrainian politics, policies of the Kremlin, and the anticipation of the negative effect of the sanctions. Over the past 2 months, the number of this attitude has grown almost twice, but still we're talking about the minority, and an unorganized minority to that. Propaganda put aside, no propaganda machine may convince people of what people don't want to get convinced. And here, whatever we say, but the general affectation and the euphoria and the general and very serious view of the Crimea story is something that has totally flooded the population today. The inability and unwillingness to understand the position of the Ukrainians, the general deafness towards the Ukrainians, who are insulted by this. because in the Ukraine there was a very high level of sympathy towards Russia. Now this has radically changed, and the recent Ukrainian polls show that the repulsion and revulsion towards Russia become the dominating attitudes of the Ukrainian public. This will not go away easily, for sure. Colleagues, the last question, and I would like to ask our expert. We have found indeed a colleague from Poland who would like to ask a question. Jakub Gielnut, you spoke about propaganda, but how is it possible that the Soviet power, the contemporary power, cut off the Russian public from the Ukrainian mass media? And this is not the Soviet time, when the information was coming through the samizdat, because every Russian may watch and read the Ukrainian materials, but the Russians don't seem to be doing that. And first of all, 90% of all respondents draw their news and information about the events in the Ukraine from the TV. The internet in itself is very heterogeneous. 10 years ago, when about 1/4 of the population used the internet, one could say that there exists the so-called party of the internet and the party of the television. Today, only 55% of all citizens go online. So internet is no longer a differentiating, is not a differentiating factor anymore. And probably only about 1% of the users of the internet watch the Ukrainian mass media or TV channels online. When we ask if the Russian mass media are objective about the events in the Ukraine, about 60% of all people that say that yes, it is objective, and only few people can say that they can not make a conclusion. There is a presumption. There is a general attitude, something that has been formulated by the propaganda. The negative view, which is extremely important factor of the national consolidation. So, in the same way, we can see the unwillingness of the public to generally perceive the situation. But people don't seem to be willing to watch or read Ukrainian mass media. I think that the greatest mistake of the Kiev authorities is not even the law on the language, but the fact that the Ukrainian TV did not start in Russian, because the east of the Ukraine was actually given as a fiefdom to the Russian TV. Colleagues, I apologize before those of you who have not asked your questions. Exchanging our opinions during this session, I think that the numbers and the ratings and the indicators inspire some sadness. Well, we are very thankful to our expert for these sad numbers, because the diagnosis is what we know. If in the days of Marquis de Custine in 1839, if we had had a respondent, the polls, we would have seen a very similar situation. What does it tell us? I think it is not getting any worse. It tells us that it is not getting better, true. But let me end at this optimistic note. We shall resume in 30 minutes.